Good evening, everyone, and welcome to FOAM, Forum for Architectural Remediation. FOAM is a young and interdisciplinary platform which we just, actually developed. And our aim is it to broaden the discourse about architecture and the spaces where it collides with different topics like social or political issues. This episode is our first episode and our first live event at the same time. We want you to introduce you, of course, to my guest, Max Steverding. Welcome, and I'm really happy to have you here tonight. At the same time, Max is our author of the first episode, and he wrote an essay which is called Imagine Cities. We will talk about later about it and discuss. The following minutes we will have actually two parts. One is Max's essay, as I said before, which we already put into our first podcast. You will listen to it. And after that, I ask him about everything I want to know about it. And of course, you're very welcome to ask your questions in our live chat. Let's start. Maybe I can start with an introduction to Max. He's doing right now his master's at the Technical University in Munich. And besides that, there he is also working as a research assistant. He's mainly interested, I would say, in the intersections of where architectural practice and theory collide. And his contribution to FOAM focuses on what different and sometimes surreal narratives are built when it comes to the term of the city. So welcome, Max. Thanks for having you here.
Thanks for letting me be here.
Of course. And as I said, you have the possibility to ask your questions in the comment section. And now I would say it's time to lean back, grab a drink, and listen to our first episode of our podcast series with the title From Area, the Right to the City.
FOAM,
Forum of Architectural Mediation.
From Underdogs to Schickeria.
The Right to the City.
Season 1, Episode 1, an essay by Max Steverding.
Imagine cities. The city is a place of the multitude, and so are its narratives. Each day, hour, minute passing by, new stories are told and yet forgotten, filling up pages in the great book of the city. Whether it be residents or visitor, all contributing to the identity of the city that is yet formed by everyone but grasped by no one. Some of them, pretending to know, claim to have sovereignty about what the city is. Others just embrace their joyful unsuspectingness. Italo Calvino states, after writing his unprecedented piece of literature called Invisible Cities in 1972, "What is the city today for us? I believe that I have written something like a last love poem, addressed to the city at a time when it is becoming increasingly difficult to live there." Was it not certainly the last love letter to a city? Its 55 descriptions of imaginative cities and its inhabitants dwells on the noticeable fact that the city as a whole becomes more and more difficult to experience. What makes up the character of a city gets either lost in its own vagueness or abbreviated by too short of a story. Pursuing to compete in the international competition for the greatest tale embodied within the nucleus of a city, writers and storytellers of all sort ambitiously publish their narratives through staged media, materializing either within the city or in the digital realm. In search of the true character of a city, one might find him or herself wandering in the imaginative collection of cities, once experienced but long forgotten, only to find the same story told numerous ways. All its flavors and fragrances, rhythms and tones amalgamated into singular visions. Once, a vibrant plurality of a moment, yet unveiling what then was the essence of that certain place and time. Just as Marco Polo reports to Khan the appearance of the variety of cities existing in his empire of sheer endlessness, our mind reconstructs the endless experiences, encounters, moods and atmospheres happening around us once we leave the comfortness of our homes or just letting the city merge with it by opening a window or two. To embark on a wander, not through the invisible, but the imagined city, constructed in our minds, might lead to far more concrete characters and narratives of the city than could ever be experienced or told about outside of our minds. Using the filter of the forgetting, the vague picture, the abstract thought in the distance, we might be able to get a feeling for what the city feels like, what it tastes like, what it sounds like, rather than what it is like. Let us stroll around concrete tales and pictures of the city to see what the city is not and yet what constructs it. Extending Italo Calvino's approach of uncovering a true feeling by narrating the constructed imagination, to distill the mechanism of experiencing the city. The city of sign. Experiencing a city is an act of doing, not merely flourishing in one's hectic everyday life. Experiencing happens either in those rare moments of a pause between the acts of the play of life, or in those luxurious moments where experience is the main purpose of doing. Valuing the preciousness of such moments, our mind is setting off to the city of sign. The city lays in the everywhere, and yet is a very special place. The name of the city becomes an idiom, a metaphor for a variety of feelings and moments. It is the city of love, the city of stars, or the city of angels. It can be picturesque, gigantesque, grotesque, or arabesque. Just as it can be, images appear everywhere around us once arriving in the city. We know what to expect, know what to look for, know where to find it. Kissing couples rig up the scene. Hectic people walking past us like actors on a movie set. Just as promised by the city of sign. We go for a stroll, just to find ourselves being mesmerized by the self-fulfilling prophecies promised to us by the city of sign long ago, before we even arrived in the city. We will repeat these mantras long after our visit in the stories, just as they were told to us before our arrival in the city of sign. Maybe Experiencing also includes finding the expected. The city of signage. Voyaging to the city of signage starts long before actually being there. One pictures walking through its aisles within the moment of a pause from the hectic, not sure whether being a distraction of the everyday or a conviction of the need for the special. The city becomes a collection of images reappearing in different forms of media all around us. Everybody seems to go there. Everybody seems to have been there. Adventurers inviting us on an imaginary trip to the city, just for a second or two. One swipe and the image fades away, only to be branded in our memory. Setting out for the city of signage, a good worked out plan is one's best companion. Expanding in the sheer vastness of the planet, the city of signage is a planet of its own. Yet all the images reappearing are woven into a dense blanket, covering all our endeavors with the warmth of the predictable. We arrive in the city with the trust in our plan, but also with the pressure of seeing all those places and experiencing all those scenes. Well-trodden paths guide us the way to another lonely insider place within the vastness of the city of signage. Divided into two spheres, our paths lay above the city itself. Looking down, we only grasp a glimpse on the mother pushing the buggy through the busy streets, children playing on the lots between the big highways of trodden routes, just to arrive on another scene, adjusting our vision to the previewed pictures. We find ourselves in the city of signage for one click of the camera only to be lost again on the sheer endless miles through the unknown. One finds to have been in a totally different city than the city of signage, and yet been everywhere one expected to be. The city of actors. There are ways of getting to the city of actors, just as there are several ways of being in it. One can voyage on a giant cruise liner after several days out on the ocean. Breathing the lagoons surrounding the city, imagination creates the Caribbean dream of a lonesome island, only inhabited by some indigenous people. The city itself extends way over its natural borders, right into the water as we drove past the city in our giant cruise ship, anchoring on a remote arm of the island. Early in the morning, we rush in the narrow, empty alleyways, shielding us from the heat. Numerous of theaters line those streets, all in different size, different couleur, yet staging the same play with the same props. Having our ticket at hand, we indulge in the play, only to board the safe harbor of our cabins afterwards, in the early afternoon, cooling ourselves in the pool on the roof of the ship, setting off for another city, on another shore, quite similar. If we approach the city from land, we wander through the vastness of a desert, planes passing us in the sky, transporting the fortunate. On the horizon, a mirage of moving light and sound promises to us the near arrival in the oasis that is the city of actors. Arriving On the cool and clear canals of the city, we dip our toes into the water. Surrounded by a hectic stream of people pushing themselves through the narrow alleys, only to arrive where they started. Although you see actors from all over the world, people from the city, you see none. They hide deep within the alleys, letting the city itself hatching the disease. The City of Merchants. A short recommendation. If one needs something, do not look for it in the City of Merchants. The city does not serve the needed, but fulfills the desired. Behind every window, there is a store selling you the filthy unnecessities of life, all selling the same, with a different taste to it yet. The sky is packed with advertisement, one whispering, one screaming their lustful promises to us. Both the stones of the street and the walls of the houses are polished. Getting lost in the elusive endlessness of the city that is a mirror is easy. Seeing yourself in the far distance, blurred by the overlapping lights, bringing us in a dizzy delirium of consumerism. The citizens, indeed, are starving, having to travel long distances to the next market where they can buy their needed far outside of the city. One barely sees them in the City of Merchants. The few roaming about the polished pavements, blinded by the lights or deaf from the sounds, are in an irresistible intoxication. Once noticed by the merchants, they are silently thrown out of the city. Everything seems possible in the City of Merchants, with its promises, yet only to the goodwill of the merchants. The City of History. The last and oldest city on our journey through the mines of our remembrance is the City of History. We are only allowed to wander around the streets with a guide, both explaining the marvelous tales that once took place on the square or in its neighboring streets, as well as surveilling us to not look around the invisible corner, revealing the facade that is the history of the city. Peeking around the corner, one might find the new side of the City of History, might find that it is all facade, but your guide carefully protecting us from such unveiling experiences. Only people walking by, dressed like you and I, hint on the different stories that happen behind the facades of history, of false narration. But what is authenticity if not a question of belief? Mesmerized from the elusiveness of the City of History, we slowly wake from our daydream, from the adventure in the cities of imagination. Is real and what virtual? Is this city of imagination just a diluted delusion or the distilled essence of what the story of the city is? Coming back into the physicality of our everyday, we realize that the narration of the city is more an imaginated tale than a materialized fact. Remembering all the protagonists in the cities, as well as their citizens, one might wonder how the story of the city and the story of its inhabitants became so different. Yet, a city's narration is told by the guide told of it, Nevertheless, to experience what the city is, one has to leave the everyday and embark on a journey both through the real and the imagined, to unveil their personal illusion of what the city narrates to oneself.
This was Distribution by Max, May 2020.
Foam. From Underdogs to Schickeria.
The Right to the City.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed listening to Max's essay, our first episode of From Underdogs to Schickeria, The Right to the City. If you missed some parts of it, it's no problem. We have a website. It's foam-network.com, where we save and archive all our podcasts. But of course, you can also use your favorite podcast app to listen to it. Our channels are called Foam or foam.network, so it's no problem to find us. And the information, of course, is also in the description below the video and in our channel. So, Max, maybe we can start with one of my questions.
Yes.
I'm quite curious to know, because in your essay, you describe different ways to experience cities, as Calvino does in his parables. And therefore, you have 5 different of city. How did you come up with the idea? And second, why did you choose these ones?
Well, like how I did come up with the idea of the overall, like how I did come up with the idea of taking like this imaginative stroll through such imagined cities, I guess is really how I approached this whole essay. Maybe I think also because of this whole pandemic and crisis currently, this the idea of strolling through the city in like one's mind and not really actually being able to stroll through the city came up, and these 5 different cities that I described in the essay, or more really came up by things that I remembered from like trips, but then also from the cities where I lived in, or from experience out of Munich, really. And they are somewhat more like my own personal imaginative cities that I stumbled across while like strolling through my own personal memories of this, and they somewhat, but I think they somewhat distill or what I try to do with these 5 cities is distill always a certain aspect that I also felt very like significant regarding or different cities that I did, or like some really strong images that I stumbled across on many cities that I visited. So it was really like I tried to generalize it in a bit, but then it was also really a personal approach on how to like generate these different narrations.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, as you say, it's a broad approach, but at the same time, I think many people can connect with the experience. Either it's like an imagination because haven't been there, but through like all the media and especially architecture, it's overwhelmingly visual. So
Yes.
you can see buildings and cities through that medium. But in your approach, it's more like a metaphoric one, and it's really nice because, as you said, it's like an yeah, a little bit like a fairy tale, and even if you haven't been there, we can connect to that. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, that's what I hope that that people can find their own, or that people can remember through this essay, like can remember their own places where they have been and where they have experienced similar situations, and maybe not the same cities that I was thinking of when creating these narrations, but I think that is also really interesting, like to see how different people like remember the different cities also. But yeah, that was what I hope, that people can like find their own story or find their own narration in these different times.
Yeah, and I think it also like reflects in what kind of bubbles we also each one of us lives, and because of that background, is it like social or cultural or political, social, like from the social economic point of view, we could live all in the same city, but if we would describe it, it would be totally different. And maybe I now pick one of the questions from
Yes.
our audience, because I saw some.
Great.
So someone is writing, cities creating places which bring together different cultures, different opinions, and diverse minds. Each one of us has a different imagination of the city life. Do we have to combine these images, or do we need exactly the diversity in our cities to make and keep them vibrant? What do you think?
I think that's an interesting question. I think that is a really interesting question, because that is also really my experience, that like many people experience the cities, even though they live, like you described before, even though they live all in the same city, have really different experiences and memories of the cities because of their backgrounds. And I think it is very, very fair, and I think that is also really what makes up this, because like I think in the first sentence I described the city as something like a multitude, so that something which brings together like a whole bunch of singularities or single entities and single imaginations and memories, and combining this in this great pot where all these different ingredients are mixing up. What I really like my answer to the question whether we would need this this one narrative is really that I think the inhabitants or the citizens don't really need this, because they are they profit from this diverse narrations of the city, because they can find themselves in all these different, or they can find their roles in all these different stories. And I would fear that cities become places of only one narration, where all these other different stories of people are not fitting in anymore. And I think this was like when I wrote down these 5 cities, I felt like this is only my view on this on the cities that I experienced, and maybe this was also really touristic approach to these cities. And I think it is really fair that that the residents also have a totally different experience. I think they are like equal in their right to be the main the narrative of the city. And I really hope that cities are not becoming places where there's only one narration, because that is really maybe also limiting the qualities of the and I think you can experience this in many cases, that there are only, or especially whole tourism sphere, that there is only like one big narration that is also really there for getting more people visiting the city and not actually being there.
Yeah, or it's like actually the narrative is telling the identity which has been in the past, but because of, like, for example, growing tourism, became less and less because, for example, people had to move out of their homes, and I think this dynamic has always existed in our history, in the history of cities, like this development, but of course through all the retail, not retail, because of the investment, which is more getting into the in the housing sector. It's becoming more and more aggressive, and yeah, difficult for people, for the inhabitants of the city to stick to their identity and stick to their narrative. And because it's often connected to the main place, isn't it? And I think that's as well as it can be a possibility, but maybe it's also the approach architects should have when, for example, they go into the planning for like public housing, social housing, if it's not just like private sector, they have to know somehow the identity of that area, to come up with good solutions for
yes, and then really also like the stories that that the different people living there are telling, because like I think this residential investment topic is also really interesting, because when you walk through the city and you see this huge billboards of developments, my experience, like when experiencing cities, this is like that most of them are quite picking up somewhat this block structure with a nice garden in the middle, and then nice residential apartments there, but they are not really connecting to maybe the character of the quarter that they are situated into, and also they are somewhat profiting from maybe the fact that subculture, or like the underdogs, like you already mentioned, also in this call, or in the title of the series, that the underdogs really made this special place, and Korea is taking over. They are somewhat using this good, or this positive image of the quarter as a vibrant and lively quarter, and just transforming the narrative by implementing these new additions to the city that are really creating somewhat a narrative that is somewhat paradox compared to what has been there before, and this I think continues in all the sectors, not only residential, also retail, thinking of main shopping streets getting really redesigned in these, and where you cannot anymore really dissect whether the central city of Munich is somewhat a historical quarter, or maybe not a shopping mall, because Kauflingerstraße is one of the most visited shopping streets in Europe, I guess, and it is always linked, like the question of how these places are narrated and how they really sell, also when you're focusing on this, or when one focused on this investment question, because then in the end also images sell, like you mentioned, also this digital approach, or the visibility of architecture also in the digital realm, because it creates somewhat backgrounds to touristic experiences in a way that can then be further promoted also through social media. And I feel like
but it's also like an imagination, because normally the places are so good that, I don't know, all the bloggers or Insta famous people go out there in the very, very early morning to shoot a video or some photos without any people. Or of course they just show like one dimension and use it more like a facade, as you also mentioned in your essay. Yeah, right. I have another question of one from the audience.
Yes.
Maybe we can answer that as well. It's, if imagined architecture shapes our behavior as much as built interventions, and if we can knock down and mold the city as we wish, how do we reshape the imagined city, and what role does the architect play?
Okay, so I think
Mm-hmm.
if we would be able to remold the city, I think the city is also somewhat the outcome of like really like processes in society that are not only reflecting like architectural style or way of urban planning, but are really reflecting somewhat also economical structures or systems that are like materializing somewhat through architecture. And if we are able to mold this down, maybe the narration of the city that is being a promoted narration, because I think that is really much, if you would want to change something, it would be really the promoted narration, because I guess like the promoted narration is that what is pushing all the other different stories that evolve in the city naturally by the interaction of the inhabitants. Then this promoted narration would be something that you would try to get out of the city. And I think maybe if you would remold somewhat the city in a way that it becomes a materialization of all the different stories happening in the city, or the different stories that the citizens are telling, then I guess maybe the architecture or this big narration is not anymore existing, because it is not only, or there is no one anymore that want to cover the whole city with a one coherent narration in order to promote this as somewhat a place to make capital out of, or something like this. And then maybe the role of the architect would be in this process of remodeling the city to give the everyday story a little bit more room in the materialization process of different narratives. And then maybe also what I would find really really productive approach would be if, especially because I think these places where you have to, in order to really like sell something, even if it's residential housing or really goods or touristy images, I think they will somewhat still like persist in this in our world, because also of social media, people will still be posting images of where they are, but maybe it is more about being conscious of that their architecture or the city is really only a background, and then maybe also embracing this, like really making it an ironical background, so people are aware of this irony that the architecture of the city itself becomes more or less only a stage of this stage experience.
Like out of the like a manifest from the post modernity, the little different types of architecture you put together so that it's really obvious that you play a little bit with the architecture and the history. Really interesting. When you talked about it and explained, in my mind popped up some examples I know from like my hometown, Berlin, where, for example, citizens really try to get engaged in the process of public, not really like public housing, but to become owner, like the ownership of space in the city. And they like developed collectives to have a chance property and to like save a piece of a specific culture in that area. And I think it's not really like a trend, because I think it's really like hard work, and you have to know, or you have to have good work. But as you can, as an architect, you can engage as well in the process of I don't know, imagined cities or a specific a narrative, by combining like what's there and what's maybe a tradition, like local materials, like I don't know, for example, in the south, that you build more with clay, or that you focus on that, and of course that you have some kind of conversation or exchange with people who live there. And maybe it's a problem because, like everything else, the world is more and more globally interconnected. So of course, building, like I don't know, from Shenzhen, they're building in Italy, or from I don't know, from Brazil, they're going to build houses in Dubai, and of course, it can be really interesting, but at the same time, we somehow have the expression of the modern architecture nowadays. And on one hand, it looks all the same a little bit, I would say. And at the same time, architects have so much freedom to build these iconic buildings where you have all this immense financial background to like build your actual imagination, you know?
Yes,
Buildings
yes.
you could have never built like even 10 years before, and then boom, you can build it. I think it's really, really interesting to find a balance in that, between reality and the imagination. There was another question. It's really nice. I'm really happy that you guys are listening and
So many
watching,
questions.
and it's nice. Here we are. Where do we are? Oh, okay. I just refreshed our conversation, so it's
More questions.
maybe here. Since the built environment follows mostly economical aesthetics, how to make sure that these vibrations or experiences, when you feel utterly suspended in time, beyond past and future, that you talked about, can be more of a self-understanding thing in our future city.
So it is. The question is how, like, I think this economic independent, like, if I understand the the question correctly, maybe the one asking the question can write again in the comments if I answered it correctly, or if I responded to it correctly. I think that this economic dependencies in architecture, like, they are really they are somewhat pushing it, or they're going in different directions. On the one hand side, narratives really do not matter, because I think architecture can be also really focusing on or can really produce materialized designs and buildings that are not really linked to any narration, and that are somewhat just existing within the built structure of the city. And then there are architecture that is really like trying to create an image, like you already mentioned, like this complex of maybe iconic architecture or star architecture that exists around the world, that is actually really, like, most of this architecture maybe people know rather from the internet than from actually being there. And like I feel, for example, in Dubai, with these, everywhere with these islands that they built that look like something, they are really only meant to be viewed from Google Maps, because I think in an era these things wouldn't have existed, because you would not be able to really see these things. And then the question on how you maybe make a valuable narrative or so in this time is, I think, because my feeling is that everyone is trying to create narration. Like you also mentioned people like that are really frustrated by these kind of architecture, and that are really criticizing maybe also this iconic architecture for being somewhat anonymous, because they're not really corresponding to anything that is really actually happening at the at the place. And thus creating, like, they're searching for another ways of rooting the architecture in the place where it is being, for example, like local material. I think this is also a way of making a narration at this certain place, but you are still also trying to like, you are still also creating a narration that is also maybe oversimplifying certain aspects of a place by saying, well, this is local building tradition, I'm just going to build like this. Because maybe, for example, these local building traditions, they, like, the people living there in the everyday surroundings do not really still build like this, but they're already focusing on something else. I think this is really, I myself do not have an answer on this, because I think this is really interesting, because with everything that you build, it seems that you are always creating a narration. And maybe the only architecture where you really do not create a narration is where the client or the investor really does not care about any narration. Like maybe I wouldn't say that this is architect, like I would totally not say that this is the best architecture, but maybe the only architecture that really does not try to communicate or tell you a story about the personal identity of the client, or maybe the brand of the investor, is really the architecture where narration is not taking into concern, because it is not maybe within the budget. So I think this
And
would
they
be...
have their own representational style and show they want to present to people who are looking at the building. Actually, it was also.
I hope this made sense. It made sense.
Me
Good
too.
for the question.
Otherwise, the people have to comment.
Yeah, people.
Showing us. There was also the question, or that someone believe or is asking actually if our cities are becoming anonymous places. I think this is something you already like mentioned and talked about, but I would also say maybe not anonymous, because it's still, of course, architecture is the space we live in, the space what surrounds us every day. Maybe in Germany we have the privilege that we have something like the Denkmalbehörde, which is actually like, of course, taking care of that part, that some things which are historically important are saved and documented and preserved. But I think as well, maybe the architect could have an, like, I don't know if you understand what I mean.
I think I understood what you mean. Like,
I don't know, sometimes with flexible architecture, you could work much better than in, I mean, if we build a house there and last there for a few decades, but during these decades, society, of course, is changing. For example, in former times, flats were much smaller, but more people were living in there. In the industrial, Zeitalter.
Yeah, in the industrial area, yeah, they were way
Area,
more crowded. Yeah.
Yeah, were more crowded. Then after the war in the 70s and the 80s, they rebuilt and widened these flats. So they made out of 3 flats 1 or 2. And nowadays they're more and more single households, for example. And they can't afford the flats anymore because they have a different cut and everything. I don't know if, I'm not an architect, but do you think there are possibilities for architects to take this in account and try to come back to the idea of the 20s, for example, where we have smaller flats, but we also have a community area where people can use it all together. Yeah, and to build in this community area or housing, they can truly celebrate their, I don't know, their culture, their necessities or whatsoever. Do you think this could be an answer to what we talked about, like and not getting anonymous, but as well building a place where you can imagine something?
Yeah. Maybe this is like to connect this maybe also with this with the question whether cities are becoming more and more anonymous. I think maybe like I experience it myself now, being here somewhat in still home office self-isolation somewhat situation. I am more and more listening and experiencing my direct surroundings, because before previously my day was somewhat like packed with things to do and traveling through the city, even though Munich is not the biggest city and commutes are quite short. You are still always constantly moving through the city, but this is not, I feel, not so much I also mentioned this in the essay on one point, that I think experiencing is really a thing that you need to do, that you perform this experience, and it's not so much a thing that happens while you are doing other things. So maybe to be able to be able to experience the city more, we need actually more time, and maybe this comes then architecture comes in place, because it enables us to in our direct surroundings and then interact with the people there, and like through these interactions new stories and narratives can evolve, but are not so much coming out of the building character, or not so much the appearance of it, because the building should not be reduced to like a facade of narration, of, like you mentioned, these places of interaction, and then maybe the way of how architecture, or maybe in architecture, is somewhat anonymous because it is not expressing its own narration over the people living in the place. But then of course, in architecture being somewhat anonymous doesn't mean that it should be only like the cheapest architecture with not nice or with great architectural qualities. I think you can produce architecture qualities without creating a narration that is like overwhelming everything else that is happening there, but enabling maybe spaces where people can meet, so they have time in their days, even if this home office and self-isolation thing some future stops, that we and our hectic life start to becoming back, that we still get like places and the time to meet and like to interact and to create the stories and narrations, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I could talk
hours and
all
hours.
but maybe we find somehow an end. We're already running an hour. It was a really, really pleasure, Max, to talk to you
Yeah, for me
and
too.
listen to your podcast. For everyone else who didn't participated in the beginning, all our podcasts will be archived and presented on our homepage at foam-network.com and on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on Instagram, of course, you can connect with us, where I think we're really curious and open to new members. If you like to engage in the FOAMS network, contact us. And yes, I think I think it was a wonderful first live event. Thank you, Max. Thank you, everyone else who was watching. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, on the homepage and the other information, you will find out about our coming events, our coming podcasts. And now the sentence I always wanted to say, I never thought I would say it in my life, but don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like our video. Have a wonderful night and bye-bye.
Bye.